Today's presenter is Dr. Todd Savitt, professor in the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies. Dr. Savitt has given several previous presentations. And here is Dr. Savitt to speak on women in medicine in 19th century America. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in the rain, and I hope I'll be able to make it worth your while. The talk is an extension of a talk that I gave several months ago. I can't remember exactly when, but when we opened an exhibit here on the yellow wallpaper, a book that was written in the Charlotte Perkins, written in the late 19th century. And I only had 15 minutes then. And so Melissa and I talked because I was a little frustrated because there was lots more that I could say. So this is a kind of extended version of that. Got some notes. The first part of the talk, you'll have to look at me because I don't have slides for it. The second part, there are some slides. So, and I'm not going to read, I just have notes here. So, okay. When you look around the medical school these days, and I should point out that it's women and medicine, and what I really mean there is physicians. I'm not including other nurses here. See, they knew. No, I'm not including nursing in my presentation, although that's another whole issue and an interesting one about the rise of professional nursing around the time of the late 19th century. So if you look around the medical school these days, you will see that at least half of our medical school classes, and in other places more than that, are women, female students, and a growing number of residents and faculty members. As you probably know, that wasn't always the case. I was a medical student for a few years back in the 1960s before I decided to become a historian. And I went to the University of Rochester School of Medicine in upstate New York. And there were 2 women in the class out of 70 of us. So 68 guys and 2 women. So it was, that's 1965. So think about how much this has changed in 40 years. Is it 50 years? Okay, I hadn't thought about that. The desire for women to become physicians became an issue in the middle of the 19th century in this country, and I'm focusing most entirely on this country. So what I'm going to do is talk about the evolution of that thinking about this issue. The 19th century was a period of change in American society, and if you can put yourselves back in the early 1800s in the United States and imagine that this is a new republic, we've just gotten our independence from Great Britain, and this is the great experiment in democracy. So the big question is, will it work? Will this great experiment work in democracy? What's happening in the US in the early 1800s? Well, the Appalachians are the barrier, and people are starting to cross the Appalachians and move westward. We don't think of it as very far west these days, but it was. And the question was, can it be governed? Can you govern such a big country, north, south, and now east, west? How big can a country get before it becomes ungovernable? Will the revolutionary spirit of 1776 linger? Will it continue? Or as time goes on, does that revolutionary feeling die out? Is it wear out? People were becoming less religious, some noted. There was too much drinking going on. Slavery was becoming a national issue. People were moving from the rural areas into the cities. This was an agricultural country. It was primarily an agricultural country, and now people were starting to move into the cities as in the beginnings of industrialization were taking place. So what happened to that nation of farmers that we started out with? 1819 was the first financial panic, the Panic of 1819, and it started this boom and bust cycle. And people wondered, well, what's happening to our economy? What is this going to continue? And the sort of symbolic blow was in 1826, exactly 50 years after we declared independence. Two men died who were founding fathers on July 4th, the same day, 1826. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, and in Massachusetts, John Adams. They were not best friends for a lot of their lives, but towards the end they began to write to each other, and they have this wonderful correspondence that is great to read if you ever get a chance. So how do you rekindle this fervor of the late 18th century and keep this country going? There began, and I'm not sure that anybody said, let's have a reform movement, but in the 1820s, 30s, even in the 18 teens, a reform movement began that included temperance, drinking, asylums. Let's find safe places, asylums, to put our people who are not in their right minds, and we can cure them. There's something called moral treatment that some folks had developed in Europe, and they were trying it out in the United States. So let's have an asylum. We call it an insane asylum. You don't think about that word asylum as a haven, but that was the idea of it when they were founded. Schooling. Let's give people, everybody, a chance to get schooled, not just the elite. What about slavery? Many Northerners were beginning to question it, and so were some Southerners. Smoking, or tobacco, I shouldn't say smoking, but use of tobacco. So the philosophy of the Enlightenment, this idea of freedom, was around in the country at the time. Industrialization and urbanization was beginning to change class structures and family structures. And finally, the role of women in society was changing. In the 16th and the 17th centuries, women's roles were much less defined. Men and women's roles were less defined. Women were very much involved and integrated into the family economy. So they were involved in the agricultural part of raising food, and then of raising children, of sharing chores, what we might think of as male chores as well as female chores. Education, taking care of the sick. There wasn't a huge amount, there was some, but not a huge amount of differentiation of roles. Everybody pitched in and did what was needed. So the home, the family, and work were all part of her job and his job in this rural agricultural society of what became the United States. In the medical world, there were few physicians in the colonies before the Revolution, and most of them were men. There were no medical schools here until after, 1765, I guess, right, 10 years before the Revolution. But most of those were men, and often came from Europe, or men would go to Europe and get some training and come back. When women practiced medicine, they did so mostly as midwives, so to speak. But midwives did lots of things to care for sick people. It wasn't just taking care of pregnancy and childbirth. They also did lots of other things, and there are some diaries that have been published that indicate how much women were involved in health care. Of course, when we think about childbirth, we think at that time, we think about women gathering together, neighborhood women, and there was no need for men to be around when childbirth was occurring. Women could take care of that. It was a natural event, a community event in the sense of many women in the neighborhood would get together. But women were also the ones who nursed the family members back to health. They didn't have the title of doctor. They did it within the context of the family economy. Male physicians were the kind of public face of medicine, and they began professionalizing in the middle of the 1700s. and they left women behind as amateurs, you might say. Let's see. Oh, I have this picture up. This wonderful picture of one of the graduating classes at Medical College of Pennsylvania. I should have put this later. This is in the in the late 19th century. I'll come back to that. One of the things that physicians professionalized over, if that's the right expression, was childbirth, was obstetrics, kind of entering right into women's world here. Forceps were developed, and on the left here you see pictures of a variety of different forceps. These are from the 1880s, but the forceps were introduced back in the 1600s, 1700s, and began to be used only by physicians, not by midwives. Midwives did not use those. Men, males, studied anatomy in medical schools or in apprenticeship. They knew the way the body was, at least theoretically, the way the body was structured. Women had the practical experience. Men studied the way the body, but they had that knowledge of anatomy. Male physicians did bloodletting, kind of, not call it surgery, but opening up the body, so to speak. Women did not do bloodletting, at least not in a professional way. So those were things that men began to use and say that they could take care of women during childbirth, that they were better at it. And an expression, the obstetricians were called male midwives in this time period, late 18th on into the early 19th centuries. Male midwives, and they began to invade this world of women. And birth, for some women, especially middle class and upper class women, became a medical event and a private event, not a community event that was natural. But men, and the other thing that men could do was use sedatives, opiates, and that sort of thing, the physicians, male midwives. So a differentiation in the household occurred, and women began to be looked at as the chief of the household, and a cult of domesticity, historians have called this, developed. Men were starting to work in factories as factories were developed, and they left women to run the home. Even if they lived in a rural area, they might go to a factory nearby. So you begin to get this focus on women in the household. Women were getting more educated. As part of the reform movement, women gained some education. And there were even books written about raising children, running a family, running a household. So the changing role of women, not the sharing of responsibilities in the home with the husband, who was now often out of the home, but the changing role of women in this early 19th century led to two different views of women in this time period. They both existed at the same time, and they were very different. I'll just keep a picture of women up there. That's a better picture. So the first view, the first way of looking at women. Women were very strong and important part of society. As one physician, Regina Morantz, medical historian of women, wrote, women were exalted as highly spiritual and morally superior, confined to the home, yet invested with genuine power and responsibility within her sphere. In this capacity, as the head of the household in the home, many women reformers encouraged housewives to learn as much as possible about their roles. And the cult of domesticity became the women's sphere. As I've said, child rearing, childbirth, marriage, family health were within their purview. Women were expected to pass on to children the Republican virtues, the virtues of the Republic, future Americans. That was part of their job. women were encouraged to reform and improve their own and their family's health. Dress reform was something that took place, I guess you could call it that. There was a movement against wearing, as you can see on the left here, mountains and mountains, yards and yards of material, very heavy material that you had to walk around with, these tight whalebone corsets that stuffed your rib cage together so that you had a hard time breathing. Those who were trying to reform this way of dress pushed it so that you wore no corsets or no strong corsets. They wore what came to be known as bloomers, named after Amelia Bloomer, a woman who developed this, and they're essentially pantsuits like this. This is Amelia Bloomer modeling her bloomers. I'll come back to that in a minute. And there was a push among some women for natural childbirth. Don't use forceps, don't use anesthesia, because men were starting to use these opiates to use so that women wouldn't feel the pain of childbirth. So the next logical step was for some women to step out of the domestic role, still taking care of the health, but to become part of the health reform movement. And they joined several reform movements. There was a health reform movement that included several groups. There were people like this, the Grahamites, followers of Sylvester Graham, and I'll say something about him in a minute. There were followers of Samuel Thompson, called Thompsonians, and I'll say more about him in a minute. There were people who followed the hydropathic movement of use of water, and I'll say more about that. I just want to give you some sense of the health reform movements. All of these were against regular doctors who were using large amounts of mercury compounds and heavy metals and bloodletting, and some argued making people sicker rather than getting them better. So among the crusaders in the alternative healthcare movement was this man, Sylvester Graham, who had a number of women followers with him. His view was that you should exercise, you should get sun, you should go outdoors, you should eat whole grain foods, you shouldn't eat meat, drink plenty of water. The whole idea was to get back to nature, interestingly, have natural foods. And one of the things he developed was something called the graham cracker, which was a whole wheat cracker that, interestingly, I'm vegetarian now. When I was first thinking about vegetarian a number of years ago, many years ago, graham crackers had lard in them, if you looked at the label. Sylvester Graham would have had a fit about that. To have lard in a graham cracker was just not the thing to do. You're vegetarian. Anyway, the Grahamite movement was very popular among middle and upper class folks, mainly up in the New England area. Another movement that was more agricultural working class folks was the Thompsonian movement, led by this man, or developed by this man, Samuel Thompson. He believed that you shouldn't use these heavy metallic remedies, that you should use something called Lobelia inflata. Lobelia, you may be familiar with as a plant. Lobelia inflata is a very powerful emetic. And so if you give it even in small amounts, you will make the person vomit. His idea was that all disease was caused by loss of internal heat. And what you needed to do was to restore that internal heat. And so Lobelia warmed up your body, gave you that heat, made you throw up. Cayenne pepper, alcohol, certain alcoholic beverages, things that would make you feel warm, and then by having that heat in your body restored, you would get better. He had a huge following. He said medicine should not have physicians, medicine without doctors. Every man his own physician was the slogan. And he sold the rights to his book, The New Guide to Health, and he would sell a box with different kinds of botanical remedies in it. And the reason I spent so much time on this is because it was a domestic system. You did it in your home. And women were the primary targets of Sylvester Graham, and he had people all over the country selling rights. I mean, it was like a business. It was a business. He even got it patented in 1810, one of the first, if not the first, medical patent, this system of his. And you'll notice that appended to the New Guide to Health with all the medical treatments is, as you see halfway down, a narrative of the life and medical discoveries of the author, Samuel Thompson. He was not a shrinking violet. He had a good estimate of himself. So Thompsonianism was a movement that women not necessarily became leaders in, but certainly were very much involved in the home. And then there's hydropathy, which did have a number of women who went to medical schools, hydropathic medical schools. All of this in the first half of the 19th century. Hydropathy was a system, came over from Europe, from Germany, in the 1830s or so. And the idea behind it was water was pure. It was the pure thing, element to get into your body and to be around your body. So you can see here, there are all different kinds of baths. Well, it starts off with sweating up in the left corner there, but then there's a cold bath after sweating. There's a douche bath, which is just putting cold water, spraying you with it. There's a half bath where you just sit in it. A head and sitting bath. Any way you could get water on the body, and also drinking it, drinking lots of water. That would prevent illness, and supposedly you wouldn't get sick, and maybe even cured illness. I'm not sure how that system worked to cure illness, but it was very popular. Here's another, but these are women now being the models in a couple of these, as you can see. And exercises. Why would you do exercises? Why would women do exercises? Knee raising, acting on the iliac and psoas muscles to invigorate the uterus, right? Because women reproduce, right? That's one of their functions. Knee separation, acting on the perineum and adductors of the thigh to invigorate the uterus. Passive stretching of the muscles to warm the surface and give general muscular strength. Raising the hips by the abdominal muscles, a movement for prolapsed uterus. All of this part of this hydropathic movement. Some allopathic regular physicians, the regular docs felt embattled by all of these reform movements, as you might guess. The AMA was founded in 1846, right in the middle of all of this. It was founded both to reform medical education, which was a mess, and that's another whole talk I could give, but also because they felt embattled and they had to sort of circle the wagons and protect themselves. So this is a caricature, but you see here's the hydropath just pumping water into this patient, because that's what a hydropath did. And the hydropathic doctor, there were hydropathic medical schools, so the hydropathic doctor was standing there helping out. This woman, Harriet Austin, was a hydropathic physician. Got her training at a hydropathic medical school in New York City, and she and a guy who actually had run this medical school in New York City, Trawl, established a place in Dansville, New York called Our Home on the Hillside, which was a hydropathic spa place to go and get cured. And that led to another whole movement that we could talk about sometime, Seventh-day Adventism. Again, that's another story. But you see her in her loose-fitting clothes here. And here she is again. She looks a little bit nicer. I know somehow this doesn't look like, this is a nicer picture of her. So women in the medical reform movement. Some of the women, as I've said, went to medical school, and here's Harriet went to hydropathic medical school. A few actually were admitted to regular medical schools. And I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes. So that's that first view, that women were important in the family, and some of them said, let's move out of the family and become part of, be physicians, be healers out there. The second view of women argued against their going into the medical profession or any other professional endeavors. I guess we can leave her up there. She doesn't really fit this description. Women were weak. Women were sickly. Women were dependent. Women were moral, training their children. Don't corrupt their virtues, their morality, by exposing them to this outside world where you see terrible sickness and injuries and parts of the human body that women shouldn't be seeing and taking care of. Oddly enough, women were already doing that, right, in the home. But to go out there in the profession was something totally different. Also, women can't restrain their sympathies the way men can. Don't teach them science. Their bodies are best suited for childbearing, as you saw with those exercises. Blood should be focused on getting to the womb, not to the brain. And books were written about this, even on into the late 19th century, about this idea that women were hurting their bodies by studying, by being intellectual, and rather they should focus on childbearing, because that's what they're here for. These attitudes were rooted in ideas about puberty and menstruation and menopause. Interestingly, you don't find mention of those subjects in the non-medical literature of the time, only in the medical literature. So they may have been a way to justify sex roles within the medical profession. Let me read you a quote here. Women's reproductive organs are preeminent. This is from the middle of the 19th century, written by a physician. Women's reproductive organs are preeminent. They exercise a controlling influence upon her entire system and entail upon her many painful and dangerous diseases. They are the source of her peculiarities, the center of her sympathies, and the seat of her diseases. Everything that is peculiar to her springs from her sexual organization. Males could control their sexual impulses. Women were unable to. Women's organs were hidden inside the body. They were secret. They were not subject to her control. Couldn't see them. They were hidden inside. They were actually subject to a biological clock. Every month for 30 years, these organs caused cyclical periods of pain and weakness and embarrassment, irritability, and sometimes even insanity. Oh, did I bring it? I have this wonderful quote that I'll end with that my sister-in-law sent me about these very things, about periodic, all of those things, pain and irritability and stuff. Okay, remind me to read you that at the end. So here's a quote. As late as 1900, a physician could picture the dangers of these events, puberty and menstruation and then menopause, in wonderfully melodramatic terms. So here, many a young life is battered and forever crippled in the breakers of puberty. This is the water metaphor here, the sea. Many a young life is battered and forever crippled in the breakers of puberty. If it crosses these breakers unharmed and is not dashed to pieces on the rock of childbirth, it may still ground on the ever-recurring shadows of menstruation. And lastly, upon the final bar, meaning a sandbar, I guess, of the menopause, ere protection is found in the unruffled waters of the harbor beyond the reach of sexual storms. You want me to read that one again? Many a young life is battered and forever crippled in the breakers of puberty. If it crosses these unharmed and is not dashed to pieces on the rock of childbirth, it may still ground on their ever-recurrent shadows of menstruation. And lastly, upon the final bar of the menopause, ere protection is found in the unruffled waters of the harbor beyond the reach of sexual storms. Wonderful. Puberty in males was viewed as a time for strengthening of the Constitution. It was a time for boys to become vigorous and muscled and go out there and do all kinds of activities. For women, it was viewed as a time of delicacy when women reached puberty. It was a time of weakness. It was a time when the nervous system became very finely tuned and was much more sensitive to stress. Boys could go out and act as they wished. They could learn however they wanted to learn. Girls had to conserve their strength, concentrate on increasing their reproductive capacities in preparation for marriage and motherhood. No education of the intense sort. This would drain energy from the crucial functions of women. Her whole life up to menopause, as that quote that I read you indicates, was considered delicate and sensitive. How could she become a doctor? But a number did, as we see here, despite these attitudes and injunctions. They had a hard time getting into medical schools, regular medical schools. This is Geneva Medical College, about 1848. This is in Geneva, New York, up in the Finger Lakes area near Rochester and Syracuse, New York. Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman to graduate from a regular medical school, graduated from this school, Geneva Medical College. If you get a chance to read any of her writing, she describes, this is she as an older woman. She describes the time when they did the male reproductive system, and the guys didn't want her there. They wanted her out. She could study it herself, you know. They didn't want her in the room, but she insisted on being there. And she writes how she had to pinch herself to stop herself from giggling at how horrified the guys were that she was in the room witnessing all of these things that any physician ought to know about. So Elizabeth Blackwell, there's a whole, we could talk about Elizabeth Blackwell, and I'll say a little bit more about her, but her story is a very interesting one, coming from a reforming family. Her family were reformers in the mid-19th century. Most of the women, however, went to sectarian medical schools, hydropathic, homeopathic, eclectic, some other movements of the time. In 1850, was this the one that's on the poster? I think this might be the one that's on the poster. This is much later in the 19th century, but it just shows that women were studying medicine. And I guess you medical students remember I showed a slide, something like this, when we were talking about grave robbing. So here's Women's Medical College. It was founded in 1850, Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. It's now been merged into Drexel University. It merged with a formerly homeopathic school, Hahnemann Medical College in Philadelphia, and became this Drexel, became part of Drexel University. So 1850. And then other women's medical schools were founded after the Civil War. But MCP, what came to be called Medical College of Pennsylvania, MCP, lasted from 1850 on until the 1980s. I can't remember when exactly it merged, maybe the 90s. Most women's medical schools tried to preserve the special role of women as keepers of the heart in medicine, the sympathy part of medicine. So women were encouraged to go into pediatrics or obstetrics, that is helping women give birth, which was an old role for women anyway, family care. Those were the roles that women should play. Let their sympathy, their natural nurturing come out and go into that field. In 1893, Johns Hopkins University opened, not without some difficulty and not without some women's help. This is a picture, late 1890s, of a medical school class at Hopkins, and you can see there are a number of women in the picture. Johns Hopkins was a businessman in Baltimore, and he willed a university. He left the money to establish a university in Baltimore. And Johns Hopkins University was founded in 1876, except for the hospital and medical school. Money was left, but it turned out not to be enough money to open the medical school. Got on into the 1880s and on to the early 1890s, and there still wasn't enough money. Some women came forward who were wealthy. They were part of, like one woman was the heiress to the B&O Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad fortune. A number of women got together. They had founded some of the 7 sister schools, if you're familiar with that, Vassar and Wellesley. What are some of the other? Smith, Holyoke, yeah. So they had money, and they made a deal with the Board of Trustees of Johns Hopkins Medical School. They said, if you set up certain requirements, and the requirements were going to be that you had to have certain basic sciences in order to get into medical school, and a college education, but also if you will take women on an equal basis with men, if you'll accept women into the medical school on an equal basis with men, we'll provide the money. So the Board of Trustees, which was all male, had a tough time, literally had a very difficult time trying to decide whether to do this or not. But ultimately, they went along with it. And so you see a number of women in the medical school. And that was, Hopkins became known in the 1890s because of that. Hopkins was the model medical school. If you're familiar with Abraham Flexner and the Flexner Report, Hopkins was the model that he used to rate other medical schools. Flexner went around the country in 1909 and rated all the medical schools in the country, and Hopkins was the model. Anyway, Hopkins was also the place where scientific medicine was being embodied, in a sense. It was founded as a research university, as a graduate university, and you went there and studied the science of medicine. So Hopkins kind of symbolized the future of medicine. Some women rejected the soft role that some women had adopted from Elizabeth Blackwell's era, and embraced science, embraced the Hopkins view that science is the future. Mary Putnam Jacobi, you see her dates there, in 1876, just about the time that the university, Johns Hopkins University, was being founded, not the medical school, wrote an essay for a prize called the Boylston Medical Prize up in Boston. And the topic that year was the question of rest for women during menstruation. She submitted her essay anonymously so that nobody knew she was a woman. And she used all kinds of scientific arguments to show that women could do just as well as men as physicians, or as they weren't necessarily slowed down by this idea of menstruation being so negative the way men had portrayed it. She tried to erase the image of women as weak and as subject to their periods. Here she is as an older woman. She took this science view. She married, her name was Mary Putnam. Putnam family was a publishing family, well-known publishing family. She came from money. She married Abraham Jacobi, who became he was a pediatrician and became the sort of father of pediatrics. Her view was that women can do anything and that they should go into science. They can do surgery, which she did. They can do any of the things that men could do. And Elizabeth Blackwell had the sort of opposite view. She was more the sympathy side. There's a book by Regina Morantz called Sympathy and Science, and it's about the history of women in the 19th century. And she kind of focuses, she picks these two leaders, leading physicians, women physicians out, as representative of these two views, that women are soft, no, women can do whatever they want. Not that Blackwell was a weak person. I mean, she had a lot to offer, but she saw women's roles as nurturing roles, as different from the way Jacobi did. So women began to increase in numbers in the medical schools in the 1890s, and things looked pretty good. And then in the early 20th century, their numbers began to decline, and decline, and decline. And over the early, and even on into the middle part of the 20th century, the number of women in medicine went down. Witness my medical school class in 1965, when I started, of having 2 women and 68 men in it. With that picture of Hopkins, you saw several women, and in other schools there were more women. There were medical schools for women. Between 1900 and 1910, when medical education was consolidating and being reformed, women's medical schools, African American medical schools were reduced in number. And so women didn't have quite the opportunities that they had to go to medical school. The schools that did take women had more women applying for now fewer slots. There weren't as many slots because a lot of the women's medical schools were closing, as well as some of the co-ed schools that took women. So it became more concentrated, and women didn't get in on the same basis as men. And so the number began to decline. Plus, open discrimination took place in medical schools. Only Medical College of Pennsylvania survived of all of the, 10 or 15 medical schools for women, and only MCP survived all of this. So on into the 20th century, what was the role of women going to be? Were they public health and pediatrics and obstetrics, gynecology and preventive medicine and social hygiene and all of those? Or are they going to take on the hard specialties? If you've read Arrowsmith by Sinclair Lewis, which came out in the 1920s, Arrowsmith symbolized this image of science, that science was going to lead us forward in medicine. And a lot of women were not interested in that. They saw what was happening was that medicine was becoming harder, not nurturing the way many of them thought. And so medicine kind of, for women, began to be less and less of an opportunity in terms of profession. And maybe it still is. It's kind of interesting. In the 1890s, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a short story Doyle was a physician as well as a writer. He wrote the Sherlock Holmes books. He wrote a short story called The Doctors of Hoyland, which was about a physician in a rural village in England. He was English. Well, he was Scottish, actually, who practiced. He had the whole countryside practice for himself. And all of a sudden, there was this shingle hung out on a house, and it said Verinder Smith, MD, in very small letters. And he thought it was a male physician, and he was thinking, oh, great, now I have somebody to talk to about. And it turned out to be a woman, a very good, very well-educated woman who did the kinds of things that he wouldn't do, the kinds of surgeries that even he was afraid to do. She did, and she eventually steals the practice. He breaks his leg, and she comes to take care of him. He falls in love with her, or at least he says he does, invites her to marry him. She says, what, and unite the practices? And he says, no. And she said, no, I'm not going to marry you. I am devoting my life to science. I can't do both. I have to devote my life to science. And she moves away. She got a position at the Pasteur Institute in France, and she leaves, and Dr. Ripley is his name, goes on, and he's back to being the only physician. So some women felt that they had to devote their lives to science, or feel this split. How do I do this? How do I have a family, raise children, which is what Dr. Ripley wanted her to do, or do I stick with my profession of medicine? And I guess that issue is still with us today, I think. And maybe that's something people would want to say something about. We have a mostly female audience here today, interestingly. But I guess I think that maybe there is an issue. It's not just in medicine, but in other careers as well, that women have to make a choice that men often don't have to make. So anyway, I'm wandering from the topic, and I'm really finished. I was trying to give you some sense of how women evolved in medicine in the 19th century, and how we got to where we are today, but I'm not sure how we got to all of a sudden now having 50% or more women in medical school classes. What's happened? And why? So that's for another time or for our discussion. So I'm going to stop there.
Do you think that the decrease in women in medical colleges had something to do with the increase of nurses? Because you mentioned a little bit about nursing.
That's a good thought.
Field developing at the time.
It's possible that happened, that was happening. I have never seen that as listed by historians as a reason why
there was a decrease.
There was a decrease. My sense was that it's a different constituency who went into nursing versus into medicine. But it's a good thought, and there may be some validity to it. I just don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have any idea, Angela?
Well, I'm wondering about the time that you say the number of women in medical schools went down, was the opening up of a lot of other disciplines for women to enter, especially at university. And women were also entering university in some places at higher rates than men, because things that they wanted to go into required college or university credentials, and men could go into business, which then didn't apparently require very much. Also, I'm not sure women were leaving the idea of medicine. I mean, that's the 1900 to 1920 was the progressive era, and that was when women got the vote, and they became even more active in reform movements, although that built up over the 19th century.
I wouldn't say that women's interest in going into medicine declined.
Yeah, because women pioneered industrial medicine at that time. They were the ones who I guess in the public health movement were forcing people to look at all the problems that industry was producing, especially since many of them were women workers.
Yeah.
I'm just guessing.
Yeah. So I don't think that women's interest declined. I think they just met those barriers, and that there was
perhaps
sort of
some
like
other, yeah, and
other outlets.
yes,
So,
such as politics, for example.
yeah.
I had a question about the hydropathy that you were talking
Yeah.
about. In the spas that you talked about, the people created up in New York, with later, more recent times with the polio epidemics and the spas that were so popular during that time, was that an extension of hydropathy or a separate movement?
There were two things going on. There were the hydropathy spas, you could call them, and then there were the mineral spas, and they were different.
Okay.
And the more mineral spas is what you're talking, or the hot water spas,
Right.
That's different from these hydropathic spas, which were much more business. I mean, they were the business of healing
Okay.
more, and they had docs there, and although I suppose they had them at the hot springs too, but it was different.
Okay. Thank you.
Talk more about that. I didn't know about the hydropathy.
Talk more about hydropathy?
Yeah. What was their premise?
The premise was that water was healing. It was the purest substance on earth. And if you could get it into your body and around your body, you would be healthy. That was, and if you exercised, as you saw the pictures, and if you ate the right foods. The Grahamite, Sylvester Graham, well, two things. Sylvester Graham incorporated hydropathic ideas into his movement, and he had lots of followers who were hydropaths, along with being vegetarian. And the utopian movements, I don't know if you're familiar with, there were these movements at the time to found utopian communities where the world was great. There are almost, some of them, I guess, are sort of socialistic. Yeah. They would have like Graham tables where if you were a follower of Sylvester Graham, you could eat vegetarian foods and get all the hydropathic stuff as well. The Seventh-day Adventists movement got started because one of the founders of Seventh-day Adventism, a woman, Ellen White, was a patient at our home on the hillside in Dansville, New York, where Harriet Austin was the physician. And she, Ellen White, was really interested in curing and healing, and she got messages from God about how to heal. And a lot of it was Grahamite, and a friend of mine wrote a book, a biography of Ellen White, in which he says basically she plagiarized the writings of the time from Sylvester Graham and his followers, from the hydropathic movement. It's all so intricate and wonderful. I mean, the stories there are really great. But that's where Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist, and Kellogg's cornflakes was part of the health foods. I have a talk called Graham Crackers and Cornflakes that takes you all the way through. But the connections are really fascinating.
So was hydropathy, was it curative or preventative?
Both.
Okay.
It was supposedly curative. I'm not sure how, to be honest, how you could cure without any kinds of medicines. But hey, the Hippocratic Oath, that oath, they swear to using dietetics as their means of cure, not medicines, not surgery. So those ideas were out there.
Was the hydropathy sort of an extension of humoral medicine, where the coolness and moistness of the water would combat, an imbalance of yellow bile or that sort of thing? Or is this, because it seems like a lot of the techniques that were shown are the same things that Hippocrates wrote about and Galen wrote about in terms of treatment of a humoral imbalance.
Did you say hormone?
No, humors.
Humors.
Bodily humors.
Humors.
Humoral.
Oh, humoral.
Sorry.
I see. Humoral. That's what you said. I know her hormone. That's because I'm thinking of those hormones are going through. Humoralism, the idea that there were 4 humors within the body and that they have to be in balance, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and a phlegm, goes back to the ancient times. And that idea of balance was around in a lot of these alternative healing movements. To be honest, I haven't read, there is a philosophy behind hydropathy. And I have to admit that I've not read it, but there is a logic to it. Just like with homeopathy, there are, the guy who founded it, Samuel Hahnemann, wrote a lot about the philosophy behind it. So I don't think I can answer your question except in very general terms, that humors, or the idea of balance was certainly there. I don't know that they thought specifically in terms of humors. Sure. I don't know if people have to leave. I hope
most of the medical colleges you mentioned were in the Northeast, and I know that the Northeast was known, especially in the 19th century, for having women authors, for having women involved in issues and politics and all kinds of things compared to the rest of the country. What about women in medicine in the South or the West? In your research, have you run across?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. You're right.
Information.
Many of them were Northerners or Midwesterners, and not many, I have not come across many at that time who were from the South. That's what you're asking.
Right.
Yeah.
Or from the West Coast.
Well, the U.S. wasn't.
Like late 1800s.
In the late 1800s, there were California, Loma Linda University, which was the Seventh-day Adventist is the Seventh-day Adventist University and Medical School, was founded back in the 1890s, and there were women physicians way out west. And actually, in the Mountain West, because I've actually have done some work on some of the Mountain West states, they had women physicians. In the egalitarian West, where, you know, Jeanette Rankin, pardon?
Where anything goes.
Where people, I mean, it was sort of pure democracy. You took care of what you needed to take care of. And women were physicians there. There were more women physicians in the West, certainly than in the South. So it's a good question, good thought.
Any more questions? Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Savitt.